Hello, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro University. And in association with our friends and partners at IFC Films, welcome to the FOLCS film series. Tonight's film, Nitram. It's a new film that opens nationwide tomorrow and is also available on video on demand. It's largely an Australian production with an Australian cast and an Australian director, Justin Kurzel, who will be joining us in a moment. It depicts what in 1996 was the worst mass shooting in the world. It took place in Tasmania, Australia. It was known as the Port Arthur Massacre. It was 35 people were killed, 23 were injured. It has since been surpassed by the one in Norway. I think that was in the 2010 with 71 people and 51 kids. But at the time, it was an international story about gun violence. This is a dramatic film and done in an extraordinary taste and style, very emotionally and psychologically complex, filled with ideas, which, as you all know, is the purpose of our FOLCS film series. And so we welcome Justin Kurzel. You may know him from some earlier films. His debut was Snowtown. Then he made a film, in my view, the best adaptation of Macbeth, starring as Macbeth, Michael Fassbender, and his Lady Macbeth, Marianne Cotillard. And then the same two actors appeared in yet another Justin Kurzel film called Assassin's Creed. But Nitram, which opens tomorrow, has been extremely successful on the festival circuit. It was at Cannes, and I'm telling you, this is one film absolutely not to be missed. Regardless of your politics about gun violence, this is a film that will change you and make you think. If you're watching us live on YouTube, welcome. Don't forget to go on folks.org, sign up for our email list so you can get advance notice of future upcoming events. If you have a question for Justin, you can leave it in the Q&A box. I think I've neglected to mention the film, the film stars an Australian cast with Judy Davis. Anthony LaPaglia is really one of my favorite actors. I was so happy to see him. And starring a new actor, Caleb, he's not that new actually, but he was new to me, a wonderful young actor, Caleb Landry Jones stars as the main character, Nitram. This is not our first mass shooting production for us talk. A number of years ago, we showed a documentary on the Newtown killings of Sandy Hook Elementary, where we had the director and some of the parents involved who were victims of the crime. And then 2 years ago, I think, or no, a year ago, we had a film that was on Netflix about the Parkland shooting in Parkland, Florida, where we had some of the parents, we had the director, and we had, I think, even the mayor of Parkland there. So this, it's tragic that we can now add Nitram to our FOLCS film series trilogy on mass shootings. And before we get to Justin, I think it's important to mention two other items. One is that just this past weekend in New York City, 29 people were shot, just this past weekend. And also this past weekend, there were shootings in spring break in Miami Beach, Florida. There's shootings in Virginia, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And the Supreme Court of the United States is about to enter an opinion, I think it'll be at sometime at the end of June, about New York gun law and a challenge to the New York gun law which prohibits you from carrying your gun outside of your home. Even if you have a license, you're not permitted in New York State. It's been a law for 100 years that you can have it in your home for self-defense purposes. You can't carry it outside, and that law is being challenged. The Supreme Court is going to be ruling on that. So this is an incredibly timely moment for us to be introduced to Nitram and Justin. Justin, welcome to FOLCS.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
First of all, maybe you should just briefly sum up, give us a brief summary of the story. And maybe you could also, while you're doing that, explain you know, the movie doesn't have a title card that says that it's based on a book or something. How close to the actual Port Arthur massacre is the film?
Well, I guess the events leading up to the shootings, it's very close. Sean Grant, the writer, was writing it in Los Angeles. He'd moved over there. He's Australian, and had some pretty close calls with a couple mass shootings in Los Angeles, and went home and really just started writing this film in a kind of fever as an anti-gun film, and found himself writing about the perpetrator of Port Arthur and about.
Did you know? Sorry, did you know he was writing it when he was writing?
No, I had no idea. So I live in Tasmania. And my wife, Essie Davis, who plays Helen in the film, is Tasmanian.
And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention Essie Davis. I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah, and so it's a very difficult event to talk about down here still, and so he sent the script to me, and I took a very deep breath and started reading it. But there was just something so familiar and recognizable about it. I felt as though I sort of knew this family, and I knew this sort of person that you sort of cross the road to try to avoid. And there was sort of something about the whole sort of lead up to it that felt close and felt, yeah, as I said, sort of familiar. And I started reading this screenplay and really started to, I guess, feel very dangerous and feel very close to an individual who, you know, makes some pretty horrific choices. And it was probably the scene with the buying of the guns in the film that crystallized why I wanted to make it and why Sean had written the script. There was something about the way in which we were sort of led to that moment really gave me, I guess, a point of view and an insight into the absurdity of gun reform in Australia at the time.
Well, we'll definitely get to that scene. Yeah, we'll definitely get to that scene. Now we're in 1996.
Yeah, look. In terms of like what the film's about, it is a very, very intimate kind of lead up to the tragic events of Port Arthur in Australia, which at the time was the largest mass shooting.
So were you living in Port Arthur in 1996? And aside from the fact that you said the story was familiar, right? The character was familiar. And do you remember whether the story itself, the events itself in 96 had some kind of profound effect on you as an Aussie?
Well, it stopped the nation. It completely floored it. And it was seismic. And I just started dating Essie, so we've been together for quite some time. And I heard her reaction on the phone when her parents rang to say that, you know, that the shootings had taken place. And it's such a small place here, so no one knew where anyone was, and everyone was, you know, deeply concerned about family members and whether they'd, you know, been traveling along that road or in Port Arthur at the time, because it's not that very far away from Hobart, which is the main city in Tasmania. It changed everything. It completely, you know, it's a very, very quiet, beautiful place here, and it shattered everything. So everyone knows where they were on the day that the events.
Right. So before we get into the film ends with a title card, and it fits nicely to what you just said a moment ago. And it says something about how there was something called the National, what was it called? The National Gun Act or something? No, National Firearms Agreement. And you make this interesting point that the law goes into effect shortly after the Port Arthur Massacre. And then not long thereafter, there's actually more guns in Australia after the Port Arthur Massacre, you know, after the passage of this National Firearms Agreement. Do you remember what that agreement was? What was, I mean, it sounds to me that there was what you describing as a public reckoning about firearms, that it stopped and paralyzed the nation. Then there was this law, and then something happened.
Well, there was. I mean, it's probably one of the most proudest things I have about being an Australian is the response not only from the government, which was bipartisan, in being able to change these reforms in 6 days. So in 6 days, there was a buyback that happened where people could hand in their guns, guns that they decided were banned, semi-automatics. And there were some of the tightest gun reforms put in place. And that was bipartisan. It took 6 days, which is extraordinary. But more importantly, it just changed, I think, Australians' attitudes towards guns. You know, we just don't see them. And we have a very, very different relationship to them. And I think it's because of the shock and the horror of that day. Since then, I mean, we were disturbed to start to see, after, you know, writing the script and doing our own research, that there are more guns in Australia now than there were in 1996 when the events happened. But also some of those reforms are now being lobbied to be weakened. And some of those reforms actually never came into practice. So you know, in one sense, it's extraordinary kind of what happened. In another sense, it's alarming to see, I guess, how some of these laws are being challenged at the moment.
So what do you think, what does it make you think, before we get into the film, that the laws are sometimes there, but they're not strictly enforced, or there's no real follow through, or, you know, in the end, people who want guns will get them legally or illegally, or they will lobby their politicians to say they want gun rights? Because the film ends on this very powerful message. And now you've just said, I didn't know this, 6 days. It's unimaginable that a government, a national government, could move that quickly. And in some ways, responding to the way you described it, national shock, right? That this national shock led to this, you know, proactive movement, but slowly deteriorated to the point where guns are back in the homes.
Well, I think that's what's, you know, that's how powerful people responded to that day. That's how shocking it was, right, that it instigated such changes in such a fast amount of time. But you know, it's a very hard event to talk about, so people don't talk about it. It's very hard to yeah, we have a very uncomfortable relationship with that day, and people are unsure about how to discuss it, how to have a dialogue about it.
And you're saying to this day, right now?
To this day, I mean, you know, the making of the film, there were many that, you know, wish it hadn't been made. When it was discovered.
Wait, I'm sorry. Many who said to you, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that you're making a film about Port Arthur.
Yeah, so for example, when it was announced that the film was being made, and we were actually making it, we were filming it at the time. I mean, it was such newsworthy moment that, you know, our Prime Minister was talking about it in Question Time, our film.
Wow.
So it sort of it tells you how sensitive the issue is, and it's been, you know, it's been a very challenging experience making it, because there are those that are passionately against any film being made about the event, and then there are others, obviously, and, you know, you found it, especially with a lot of young people that weren't born at the time or were very, very young, have a real sort of curiosity as to kind of why and how this event happened, and why Australia is different to what it was in 1996.
But people would object because, or raise their concerns because they don't want to be reminded of it in such openly public way? Or is it something that I was going to ask you later, but I might as well ask you now? The movie is very psychologically complex, and Nitram, there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of things in him, right? Like, you know, it's an emotionally complex portrait of a mass murderer, you know, on the weeks before he actually commits the crime. And I wondered whether the people would say, yeah, but you're going to humanize him, right? Or you're going to make him, you're variably going to make him more famous. Is that part of what was going on among Aussies?
I think so. I think it was two things. I think at the time when obviously people hadn't seen the film, many people believe that we were going to show the shootings at the end of the film, which we don't.
And you do not, right?
No, and the other is, you know, it's challenging for us because we are telling the story. We felt as though to tell the story in the most shocking and compelling way in regards to the dangers of weakened gun laws. We needed to tell that through the family, but also the perpetrator. So it's you know, that becomes a real balancing act in regard to, you know, your empathy towards that character and whether that character deserves to, you know, have a film made about them. So that was really tricky for us to be able to tell this story about the importance of gun reform and how this event changed things in Australia. We needed to take you into the steps of this individual and show you how quickly and dangerously isolated they become. And at that point, at that crucial point, they walk in and they buy guns like golf clubs.
Right.
And that to me was always the film. It was always leading to that one scene. But to get there, you needed to kind of travel with this certain individual. So that's been the hardest aspect of making the film. You know, where how you know, take an audience through this this point of view.
So you're, from what I've seen, Macbeth alone, but I've also seen Snowtown, which I think in America has a different name. I think it's called The Murders of Snowtown, I think.
Snowtown Murders, I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, a little different, right? But you're a very visual filmmaker with just a wonderful cinematic sensibility. But it sounds, on listening to you here, that this was a different project. First of all, the film is shot in a very interesting way. I think I read somewhere that the pandemic helped you because it, you know, it's very Spartan, it's very spare. You know, there's no one on the streets. You know, you feel the isolation of Nitram, you know, his friendlessness, his, you know, his just the feeling that he's not anchored to anything, not to his family, not to a church, not to, we'll talk about surfing, because surfing has a very interesting subtext, I think, in the movie, a very smart way of thinking about it. But it sounds like you were saying, hey, you know, I'm a filmmaker, but I'm also, in this instance, I have to be careful of the story and I have to be sort of an activist in a way, because in some ways I really want to tell the story about the moment in the gun shop. Like, to me, that's what it sounds, you've already said it twice, that like, to me, that you even said it was crystallized in the script when you read it first, that's really the core scene. So I wonder whether that this was just a very different experience, because you're thinking, you know, I'm not just a filmmaker, but in this case, because of the sensitivity of the material, I'm kind of an activist.
Yeah, well, look, as a film director, what interests me a lot about it was to sort of put my filmmaking to one side in a way. And I know that sounds really odd, but probably with previous films, some of the cinematic choices were very prominent, were very bold, and were very part of a particular point of view that I was looking at. With this one, I was genuinely wanting to find the most simple way to make the film, where the camera felt at times distant and watchful of the main character, that there was virtually sort of no music in the film, that there was something very restrained, and that my, I guess, flourishes as a filmmaker were sort of
suppressed.
You know, were suppressed. Yeah.
Yeah, and no,
So
that's an
it's
interesting. Yeah, it's
yeah.
an interesting
So
way
it
to
was a
think of it,
really-
because I've seen your other films, right?
Yeah. So it was a really as a filmmaker, it was a really important film for me to be involved in, because I learned an enormous amount about restraint. I learned an enormous amount about simplicity, and about you know, taking a back seat in a way at times to allow an authenticity and a clarity to come out on screen. So that definitely sort of played very strongly in directing the film.
So let's talk about that gun scene for a second, the gun shop. There's so much interesting things that come following that scene. But one of the thoughts is that the film is clearly making a statement that there's a casualness, at least in 1996, about the purchase of a gun, the simplicity of it. I mean, there's this moment in that scene where, you know, he just keeps showing them a bag full of money and saying, look, I've got the money, I have this is what I need. And it's clear that the gun owner, the gun shop proprietors are, oh, no, that's good. We're glad you have the money, but we have to take care of these other issues. Like we got to show you how to use it. But there's a casualness with which it turns out that he actually has a skill with firing a weapon that we didn't know, but he discovers that himself. But it does seem like that it's representative of a number of scenes in the film in which people bump up against Nitram and he's just not right. You know, he just seems like just the opening scenes. He's like a firecracker that he himself is ready to blow. And I wonder whether this is something that is, you know, that we could make the same argument in any country in the world, or is this an Aussie phenomenon that people don't interfere in people's lives? You know, it's like they recognize he's the village idiot, but nobody, the school principal, the guy who works in the BMW shop, there's all kinds of people that witness him in a way. And I wonder whether that's one of your points, is to say, you said a moment ago, you said, yeah, I feel like I bumped up on the street against people like someone like that. Like I might have met someone like that. I wonder whether that's one of the perspectives of the film, that at different points, including the parents, they knew something was wrong.
Yeah, I think, I think obviously these individuals are everywhere in the world, those sort of outliers that, you know, obviously become more and more isolated and become dangerous. But there's something about Australia that if you're a young male and if you're not part of a tribe, you know, if you're not part of the surfing tribe, if you're not part of the football tribe, if you're not part of a band, if you're not part of, you know, a church, if you're not part of,
you mean the sense of being anchored for a male?
The sense of a young, yeah, as a young male, you know, in Australia, if you're not playing sport or if you're not unbelievable on a surfboard, there's not much, you know, when you're growing up in certain areas, there's not much more. So if you're sort of falling between the cracks with that and you don't have a tribe, you know, it's hard to find one. And I think that the film definitely sort of speaks to a sort of identity in that sense, that you know, he admires these gods, and these gods get on surfboards and they ride these waves and they have these amazing bodies and these incredible hair, and women fawn, you know, sort of for them, and they become kind of like these gods here in Australia. And he looks at them and he wishes desperately that he could be that, and he's not. And in fact,
you show that there are efforts that he makes, futile efforts, but it's interesting, subtle ways throughout the film where you're saying, here's a guy that is just dying to be a surfer and isn't and can't.
Yeah, no, and it's not only that, it's a particular Australian male that he feels as though he sort of needs to be. But I think you know, from our research, there was many instances of him trying many different hats. You know, there were sort of reports of him suddenly sort of dressing up like a hippie, or suddenly dressing up as an artist, or sort of, you know, and I felt that in Sean's script, this real sense of trying to belong. And
I see.
Yeah, and you know, and it's interesting that the time where he does belong in the film happens twice. It happens once with Helen, where he comes across this woman that introduces him to art, you know, that introduces him to music, and a kind of tolerance. And the second time,
and sees something in him that is like lovable or charming, or, you know, there's something that she sees in him. By the way, your wife's performance is amazing in that way. that the
Yeah.
way she literally adopts him and accepts him in a way that even his own parents can't.
Well, so much so that Judy Davis, the mother, sort of actually asked Helen, "What do you see in him? What am I missing?" You know, and,
That's right.
you know, which I found a really amazing moment in the film. But then the other tribe that accepts him is, you know, is this sort of gun tribe, and
Yeah.
you know, he walks into that shop and he's offered everything. You know,
But
and also he picks one up and he knows how to handle it, and you know, in that moment you're sort of starting to see him gravitate towards something that's just horrific.
There's some. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry.
No,
No,
finish. I just wanted to say about that, you know, just about the dignity that he finds in that, because there's something about once he starts acquiring guns, he acquires an arsenal, and all of a sudden he's dressing better and he cleans up the house, which I think is just, I've never seen anything like that. It was such a clever way of showing that here's he finally is going to look better. He's going to live better, as if something, you know, it's like he creates an altar out of all of the weapons by laying them out in a very organized way with the ammunition. You know, the guy's a slob the whole movie until that moment.
Yeah, and look, I think a lot of that has to do with the mother, who keeps on sort of, you know, spend her life picking up after him and saying to him, you got to clean the house and you've got to do this and you've got to do that. And he sort of does in this sort of, you know, Last Supper type moment with her, where he invites her around and she brings him pies and he's cleaned up the whole house. And there's something about him cleaning up the whole house that frightens her.
You mean as if it's a foreshadow of something?
Yeah. There was always something that we discussed about her not knowing, but what she knows is that there is behavior going on that feels different in her son. And you know, and obviously since Helen's died and since his father's died and he's cut off more and more from her, that there's something estranged that she feels towards him. And there was something about cleaning up that whole house that felt very foreign, but also dangerous to her. For
foreboding. Interesting. So yeah. I'm going to give you I have a really good Aussie anecdote for you. Years ago, I think you're going to like this. Years ago, I wrote a story for the New York Times when Shine came out. That's how many years ago this was. I don't know. Were you born at that point? I'm probably so much older.
No, I think I was in my early 20s.
Okay, do you even know what I'm talking about? So Shine comes out. It wins a number of Academy Awards. The New York Times calls me and says it has a kind of weird Holocaust piece in it, and it's what we think that, since, you know, maybe you can find. So I call up everyone in the cast. And I called the director, a guy named Scott Hicks. You probably know who he is. Yep. Had a great moment with him. He was sitting in Sydney on bleachers watching his son play footy. You know, I guess that's what it's called, football. So it was, I had a moment with a director who was watching his son play football, and we're talking about the film. And one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is because there's something similar here, which is that in Shine, there were a number of potential reasons for why Helfgott, who was a real person in Australia, concert pianist, why he was schizophrenic later in life. Why was he so mentally ill? And this film does something else to say, I think very similar, but even more complicated, to say that there's almost a number of choices that Justin Kurzel introduces. And I wonder whether that was intentional. Isolation, rage, unemployment, mental illness, not being on the meds, permissive father, emotionally withholding mother. I mean, it's just an endless stream of things. The mocking, berating by other people who know him, the rootlessness, he doesn't have a job, right? And again, the meds is another issue that comes up, where she even says to him, are you taking your meds? We don't even know in this movie what he suffered from, right? So it reminded me as well, I know these two Aussie directors who did something very interesting in not pounding your head with what it was, but to introduce a sort of menu of things and let you think about how they all may have coalesced, and in this case led to a massacre.
Well, I think, you know, that's, I think Sean and I always wanted that. We wanted you to feel something in this film towards this character in regards to feeling a life there that was not about, okay, well, these are all the causations of why he's going to do what he's going to do, but more creating situations, creating scenes, creating moments that you feel are familiar. So it's not, I'm not talking about feeling for the character, it's more about feeling that there's something recognizable and familiar in this, that I sort of know this world, and that once you become intimate with that world, then it becomes, you know, it becomes frightening when you're starting to see where it's leading, you know, that you can sort of feel the train crash is coming. And I think that there were many factors, I think, involved, and it's kind of impossible for Sean and I to, you know, clarify more one than the other, or what was it. But what we definitely wanted. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. But go. You said, but what we definitely.
What we definitely wanted was a sense of, can we get an audience to get to that place with him where they no longer trust, but they recognize who this individual is, but they don't trust. There's something that's becoming so dangerous about them, and that moment that they don't trust is the moment that he walks into that store. That was
Right.
always so important to us. So it was about this, you know, it was about taking you into the life of someone who is dismantling, you know, and allowing that to sort of play out, and for you, as it's playing out, for you to kind of go, this doesn't feel a million miles away from, from that suburban street I live in, from that family I know, from that mother that I know, and from that individual that feels like someone that I can remember in my childhood.
But Australians are going to see this differently from, say, Americans,
Totally.
right? Because so for instance, an American isn't necessarily going to know that there is a gun shop. You know, they're not going to necessarily know unless you read, you know, something about the film. If you just watch it, you may not realize that there's going to be that moment that for all of Australia, they know this ends really, really bad. And it's going to end because he acquires guns. So the question is, how did he acquire guns? And that somehow, Justin Kurzel will tell us how he acquires guns. And similarly, I'm curious in answering that question, whether Australians are going to wonder, hey, I didn't know or never considered all those other factors. All I knew is that he killed 35 people and wounded 23. I didn't know anything else about this guy. Is it possible that Australians are going to go, I never heard of anything until this movie came out that introduced a level of complexity that Australians simply refused to accept before? Unless you're saying, no, Thane, everybody knows that this is the kind of guy he was, and it was a familiar situation, that everyone knows someone like this who is just not fitting in. And that's why this is how they respond.
Look, in some sense, I think Sean and I made this for Australians, you know, in that I think we wrote it in a way which was every single scene will be interrogated, because everyone knows what is going to be happening at the end of this. And in a sense, that was the right thing to do, because it made us really be very disciplined and interrogate strongly, everything in the film, because of the context of what people know is going to happen at the end. But in Cannes, when it played, no one knew.
So really. was there gaps meaning that the
Well, it
audience
starts off.
literally were surprised to know, oh my
It,
God,
it
this
was.
is
There were gasps when he walked into the gun store. There was a
because the
significant.
idea, this is the last guy that should walk into a gun store, right? That's the idea.
Yeah, and but you know, the film, if you don't quite understand or are aware of the context of the film, it starts off as a family drama, you know, and then it sort of moves into this sort of relationship between this, you know, between this woman and this man, and it's different, I think, from what people are expecting. And definitely, if you don't know the context of it, you know, you get caught up in this family drama.
Yeah, but you know,
and to some extent, that was also something that Sean and I were really wanting to do, which was to sort of, you know, for an audience to be watching this and suddenly realize, and even those that knew the context, Australians that knew the context and went through that day, that suddenly you almost surprise yourself that you're suddenly in this family, you know, and it's playing out, and it's they're having a meal on a Sunday and they're watching television, and you know, there's a sort of normality of it.
Yeah, yes and no. And I'm going to tell you now, as an American, this to me is not the family of, you know, Elle Macpherson. You know, this is not the family of the band members in Excess. You know, I'm trying to say this is not an Australian family that I've ever been introduced to. This is in my view, very dysfunctional, troubled, unraveling in a way, vulnerable in a way. I mean, there's a complexity here that I simply have not seen. I'm not saying that all families in Australia, you know, look like, you know, it's out of Kylie Minogue songs, or Olivia Newton-John. I understand, but I'm just saying this was an unusual film from in my view, as an American, to be introduced to this Aussie family. This I've never seen, because I even think that you introduce, you know, since he's on medication, you introduce the possibility that the father has his own mental illness, right? That this is, by the way, that happened in Shine. that actually happened in Shine, where the sister, Helpgot's sister, who was in Israel, called me up when I was writing the story, and she said, you know, Scott Hicks didn't tell the story that there was schizophrenia in my mother's side of the family in Australia for years. She said, that's not really in there, because that's really a big part of it, that this was an inherited problem. And I thought that you at least introduced the possibility that the mother is the only one that knows this might actually run in the family.
Yeah, look, I think
I'm just saying, are Australians going to recognize this family? That's what I'm wondering.
Oh, I think so. You know, I think that what's, unlike my first film, Snowtown, which was very much about a disenfranchised community, you know, where someone comes in and exploits that, a community that's kind of invisible. This was a family living on a street in North Hobart that was pretty affluent. I mean, this is middle class Australia.
I see.
You know, this is not some sort of tucked away neighborhood or you know, or hermit. Like this was, you know, and also, you know, was a figure that it's surprising in Tasmania, especially in Hobart, how many people remember him in regards to seeing him on the street or seeing him in a cafe. I mean, he was very visible. So,
but that goes to the point I raised before. Was he visible in the way that I said before, that everyone sort of knew that one day, something terrible is going to happen? I can tell you something, Justin, in the United States, that's what happens to us. It happened with Parkland. It happened with Newtown. It's always, you know, there was something wrong.
yeah,
And we knew and somebody should have done something earlier. I'm wondering, did all the people?
I think so. I from the conversations I've had with people, that there was concern, and you know, and hopefully the film kind of shows that elevation of concern, you know, before some of those choices are made by him to buy those guns.
So let me ask you another question about Australia. You know, another thing I once did an op-ed when the Norway killings had happened. I did an op-ed actually for the New York Times, and I raised this question. I said, the Norwegians had the 21-year life sentence is the maximum penalty you could receive in criminal law in Norway. And I wrote an essay and I said, well, this guy killed 71 people and 50 some odd children. And the Norwegians were not equipped to know what to, like what you said, paralyzed and shock in Australia. I'm saying the Norwegian legal system didn't know what to do. They'd never seen anything like this. Their laws were not contemplating a mass murderer. And somehow a 21-year sentence did not seem appropriate. So I'm wondering whether, since the film doesn't take us into what the mourning period, were Australians calling for the death penalty? Were there Australians saying, yeah, but he had mental problems? Is he still in jail? I don't even know. Is he still alive?
Yes, no, he's still alive in a prison in Tasmania. Yeah.
And it said that he had been given 30 some odd sentences run consecutively, so he can't get out of jail. But there is no death penalty in Australia, right?
No, there's not. No.
And was there some contemplation that people were saying, well, this is just so beyond anything that's ever happened. Here's the one guy that deserves that.
All I can remember from the time was an absolute, just absolute shock and grief. Just people unable to really talk and discuss it. And just incredible action into political action into, changing these laws straight away. So that's where the focus was at the time. But it was, nothing had been seen like this. That's the thing. It was such a horrific and extraordinary event, tragic event that I think shocked the world as well in regards to just the number of people that were killed. So there was something very shocking about that.
So
it was the first time that that number of people had been tragically killed in such an event. So that I just remember, I remember that being unbelievably confronting and shocking, and Australians looking at each other and going, how did it happen here?
Yeah.
And well, not only here, but how did it happen in Tasmania?
Yeah. Well, the Norwegians had that too, of course, the shock, but they also, again, just didn't know how to respond to it legally or morally, right? For instance, let me ask you this question. Nitram, whatever his name is, I don't really want to know his name, but Nitram has been in prison now, from what you're telling me, nearly 40 years, 36 years or something. Right?
25
oh,
years.
Right, no, 22, 26 years, 26 years. If it were 10 years from now or something, do you think that, given what you've described, if he were ever to be permitted coming up for parole, how would Australians feel about that?
Well, he wouldn't. There's just no way. It's an idea that I don't think we could even fathom or think of, because it's just not realistic. He will die in prison. That's the fact.
People think, in the United States, we're unfortunately much more accustomed to gun violence. Even just last week, we had confirmation hearings for an incoming Supreme Court justice, and some of the discussions talked about rehabilitation. So the idea of how to punish, what's the appropriate punishment, is something that Americans really spend, an enormous amount of time thinking about. And so the way you've described the shock from this, and again, in America, we have school shootings, and then we have more school shootings. We've had more Port Arthur events. I guess you can reassure the audience that's watching from around the world right now that nothing else has ever happened since Port Arthur that was like this in Australia?
No, not in this magnitude or scale. It's been the gun laws that were changed have significantly made things safer in Australia
I
over
see.
the last 5 years. So, look, I mean, it's, while I was filming in the film, it was November, I think, of 2020. And by November, October, I think the number of mass shootings that had happened in America were over 480 just for the year. So it's a very different conversation.
No, we're in nerd to it. We claim to be in shock, but we're really not. We're in shock for maybe a moment, and then we strap ourselves in prepared that we're going to go through this again.
I think that's the film. I mean, even talking to Caleb about, he's from Texas, and and that was really unusual, having
I didn't
American.
know that. My God, he was so great. He looked Aussie to me.
Yeah,
really...
Caleb's, obviously, sort of was in Get Out and Three Billboards, and someone that we sort of saw and really instantly sort of thought could be a possibility in the film. But he was born and bred in Texas, and and his relationship with guns are very different.
Very permissive gun laws.
Yeah, so from him being in, having his bag scanned before he went into school, and I mean, it's just so different from what we've ever grown up with, from what my kids have ever grown up with. So I don't know, talking to him about gun reform and gun culture in America, it's sort of overwhelming for him. It's like, where do you start? And there's a sense of, right, so another one's happened. And I think that's the tragedy, is that there is a sort of overwhelming sense of hope, of what do we do? How do we change? In Australia, it took this event and the shock of it and the anger of it and the grief of it to substantially change things in 6 days. And that's pretty amazing.
Let's talk about something you said earlier that I want to explore a little more. This has to do with, humanizing Nitram, by giving him a full dimension as a human being, right? Not just, you resisted the temptation to make a movie of pure evil, right? This is not pure evil. I remember years ago, there was a German film that was translated into English called The Bunker. And then there was a TV movie series about Hitler. And they were both movies that sort of did the same thing. Of course, the Holocaust is not the same as Port Arthur in Tasmania, but I am saying that the Germans didn't know how to feel about the movies, because in The Bunker, Hitler is portrayed as someone who loves animals, is very loving to children, and very sweet to his secretaries. And the idea was that it was a kind of, of course he's a monster, but we're seeing something else. And I'm wondering whether this was something that, knowing the sensitivities of your nation, knowing that people even raise it, knowing that your prime minister discussed it in a public setting, is this something that you're concerned about? A victim's family saying, you have given him a kind of personality that, your own wife, who is an actress, so convincingly portrayed, of something that was yet lovable about him.
Yeah, look, it's every single time I put the camera up, I was questioning that.
Wow. Wow.
And it was the hardest thing about making the film, and the hardest conversations I've had post the film have
really
been about. Yeah, and you're trying to get under, and you're trying to understand how and why something like this happened. You have to start to imagine this person with a family and imagine him being someone's son, and so it's very challenging what that line is. he does something so monstrous and so horrific at the end of this film. So what is the character leading up to that? And that's something that we debated, discussed, argued quite passionately about throughout the whole film. It was interesting, the film had a slightly different ending to the one of Judy holding the cigarette at the end.
Really?
And yeah. It ended back at the cottage that his father wanted to buy, and where there's a sort of siege there, and we had sort of police surrounding him, which is sort of what happened, and part of the transcript actually that played out of the character sort of demanding certain things, believing.
You're saying that is actually closer to what actually happened, not what happened at the beach?
No, what I'm saying is that after the shootings, there was a scene. There was a scene where the character went back to the
house where he had already
That's
committed
right.
the first
Yeah.
crime. Okay, I see.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead.
yeah.
Sorry.
It was a scene where the phone sort of goes dead, and he can't hear the person that he's talking to on the other end, and he keeps on repeating his name, Nitram. And actually the scene was spoke in a script form, spoke very directly to the name, the title of the film.
Huh.
And we had finished filming the scene in the cafe, and that final moment where he takes the gun out. We always knew that we would sort of cut there. We filmed Judy out on the porch, reflecting on her last meeting with her son after he cleaned the house, and then we went
with
to
the
film
television not on. With the television
was
news?
always on. The television was always on.
And the news was being communicated at that moment.
It was, but she didn't hear it.
I know, she never heard it. I understand.
Yeah. So, but I didn't know how to film this character after that event. So after he pulled out those guns, it was really interesting. We had a huge debate about it. I didn't know what my relationship was with the character. Caleb didn't know how to play the character. I didn't know where to put the camera. And there was something about after that moment where he takes the guns out at the cafe, it's like our relationship with this character was no longer existed. And we found it very, very hard to film that scene, and to a point where I kind of decided in my head while I was filming it that it wasn't going to be in the film. And that
more importantly, that you didn't need it.
That I didn't need it. That actually what was the most powerful moment to finish the scene on, or the right moment to finish the scene on, was of a mother.
Yeah.
On a balcony, looking out across the suburbs of Hobart, smoking a cigarette, still thinking about the son she saw 24 hours before, about who he had become, or what he might become, or what he might do. So that seemed to be that, and the isolation of her, and as the film played out, the whole, I think the whole theme of parenting became so much more, just existed so much more in the film, and all our discussions became about parenting and so forth. So there was something about the image of a mother at the end that felt right to us, as opposed to what had been written, what had been in the script for a very, very long time. Yeah. And a lot of that had to do with us not being able to have a relationship with this character after that event.
Yeah.
It was a visceral, experience. It wasn't intellectual. It was kind of like, I don't know how to.
But let me give you an intellectual answer to that, because I think I understand emotionally, viscerally, why you would make that choice. But I'm saying, as an American who didn't know anything about the massacre, that movie of the hostage negotiators talking to him on the phone, we've seen 1,000 times. Nitram, we haven't. That I can tell you right now, that you made the right decision intellectually, not just, you know, I think aesthetically, emotionally, because you didn't know how to shoot him. You didn't know how to put the camera as you described it. You didn't know, Caleb didn't know how to play him. But I just think this ends with much more emotional intelligence, as well as it makes aesthetic sense to say, yeah, we all know the story about the guy, you know, Sidney Lumet did this with Dog Day Afternoon, right? We've seen the movies where the police are outside and there's a guy, official guy, who knows how to talk to people in these and try to get him to come out of the house without, you know, hurting himself or something. We've seen that. This was a much more, in my mind, smart, original ending. So I just hope that before we say goodnight to you, I have maybe one last question, maybe two, but just, you know, in America, again, we've described big difference. We're a nerd to this. You know, it's really tragic how we just accept this time and time again. But the pro-gun lobby, the people that Caleb knows from Texas, a lot of people, I'm sure he would say, oh, yeah. There are a lot of people in Texas who would say two things. One, America is a violent nation, and so we need guns for protection, and Texans know this. But more importantly, what you're describing is a mental health problem. It's not a gun problem. I'm wondering whether you think Nitram, how does Nitram help or hurt that argument? Not that you made it for that reason. You described the film.
I think it's both. You know, the days that those guns came out on set and we had a look at them, and the armorer said, you know, you wouldn't even have this as a military gun on a battlefield.
You mean the person on the set who's responsible for
the person
guns.
on the set that is the gun armorer that is, you know, safely kind of providing us with the replicas of the real guns. And when you see them and you see them all together, you're thinking, why do we need this sort of weaponry to defend ourselves? You're not using it for hunting. You're not using it to defend yourself. It's not used on a military field. Why are these guns in our everyday communities? The absurdity of that it's just crazy. And I felt that the day I saw them, just saw them. So I think it is about our relationship with guns and why we need certain weaponry and this justification that this weaponry is somehow connected to self-defense. I just don't buy it. And I also think, yes, there's another element of the film, which is how do we look after each other? You know, how as people do we look after those that are struggling, those that are isolated, those that are obviously in trouble? You know, how do we make them less invisible? How do we, you know, what is our relationship to those that are, you know, are in dangerous, you know, stages of their life? How can
because
we?
You think there could have been an intervention along the way that would have stopped this?
I don't know about that, but I do think that there were signs, and I do think that it's a bigger thing than just this film. I think it's about, you know, that's what I found powerful about the screenplay, was that I recognized that boy, you know, at school that had been suspended for the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th time onto the 10th school. So how do you, you know, how do you help someone like that? How do you get a kid back to kind of, you know, even keel? Like how do you shape someone and help someone? And I think that the film and just by making the film asked a lot of questions about how we look after each other, because we've all done that. We've all walked, you know, we've all walked the other side of the road. Right. Because here comes someone that, you know, and I think we've all gone to school with, you know, kids that you know, are troubled, you know, or are going through challenges. Right. And I don't think it is about one mental illness. I think it is about a collective need to be able to actually help people and to keep our eyes out for each other.
Great answer.
You know,
I'm going to give you one question from the audience, and then we got to say goodnight to you. And thank you. This is from Christina Y. I'm sorry I couldn't take any other questions, but here we go. Hi, Justin. Nitram is my favorite film I've seen this year. I read in an interview with Caleb that a lot of the movie was filmed in sequence, and it really helped him find the character. Was it helpful to you to film that way?
Yes, it was. It was quite deliberate to film that way. And I think it was for Caleb to be able to sort of chart and understand, you know, when he's becoming more isolated, when he's becoming, and in fact, I think there were particular scenes that we shot with two different performances. You know, one performance that perhaps felt a little bit more dangerous and unhinged, and another one that felt more naive. You know, so it was really interesting as we sort of went along. I was quite, because in the edit I was then having to be very forensic in how I kind of charted that journey for the character. So that helped enormously. And then, you know, it was interesting. The cast suddenly started to become thinner, and in the you know, they started to sort of drop off, and we were suddenly just left with Caleb, and it was interesting. The filming of that last week reflected sort of very much what was going on in the storytelling.
You also like the sense of desolation, isolation, the friendlessness, completely cut off from humanity. All right, before we say goodnight to Justin, good answer to that too, Justin. Thank you. A couple quick announcements. Let's see, what do we got first, Madeline? What do we got? Yes, of course, if you haven't yet signed up for FOLCS.org, so you can get ongoing information about our events and subscribing to our email lists. And of course, if you're feeling generous, in a generous mood, we'd love to accept a contribution to our nonprofit, the Forum on Life, Culture and Society at Touro University. It would be very much appreciated. Justin, I just want to say congratulations on a really marvelous achievement. You are definitely a filmmaker all of us are going to continue to watch and look out for. I'm telling the audience, don't miss this movie. Don't not recommend this movie. It may be, in my view, Christina Y said it's her favorite movie of the year. This is a movie that will change you. It'll change the way you think. It'll, you know, complicate your emotions on this issue. And this issue is not going away. In fact, it's more urgent than ever. And I love the fact that Justin described that he sort of made a movie that speaks to his people, to the Australians, but it has such a universal punch that the rest of us are, you know, being treated to it's like really a window into the psyche, not of just an unraveling, unhinged mind, but an entire nation that went into mourning and shock on account of this. Justin, we'll hope to see you again on our stage. Again, congratulations. Watch the film. And until next time, my name is Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.